They called him crazy, but after 16 years of digging what he found, Richard Mitchell felt his hands tremble as he held the shovel dirty with red earth. The neighbors from the small town of St. Benedict of the South, in the countryside of Tennessee, would pass by the dirt road and shake their heads with disdain, whispering among themselves about the man who had lost his mind. It had been like this every day for 16 long years. Richard would get up before sunrise, drink his black coffee without sugar, and walk to the land he had inherited from his grandfather Samuel. There, under the scorching heat of the backcountry, he dug. He dug with the determination of someone who knew his life depended on it, ignoring the cruel laughter and the malicious comments that echoed through the small town. "Look at crazy Richard digging holes again," commented Mrs. Dorothy from the grocery store, pointing out the window while serving customers. 16 years digging the same spot. If there was anything there, he would have found it a long time ago. The other customers nodded in agreement, some laughing openly at the situation that had become the town's free entertainment. Richard heard the comments when he passed by to buy his meager provisions, but kept his gaze fixed on the ground, his calloused hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of his worn-out pants. His wife, Jennifer, had left 5 years ago. She couldn't bear to see her husband spend every penny they managed to save on shovels, pickaxes, and other excavation equipment. She tried for years to convince him to give up that crazy obsession, but Richard wouldn't listen. When she finally packed her bags and moved to her sister's house in Nashville, she left only a note on the kitchen table. "Richard, I can't live with a ghost anymore. You chose a story that died with your grandfather instead of choosing our family that is alive. When you decide to come back to reality, I'll be waiting." Their daughter, Emily, then 13 years old, was split between her parents for a few months. But she soon realized that life in the capital was much better than staying in that small town, watching her father slowly destroy himself. She visited Richard only when Jennifer forced her to, usually at Christmas and on his birthday, always with a sour face, and answering in monosyllables when he tried to talk. The land where Richard excavated every day was 3 kilometers from the town center. It was a 5-hectare property with an old, crumbling adobe house. That had been the home of his grandfather Samuel, a simple man who raised his grandson after Richard's parents left for New York in search of a better life when the boy was only 8 years old. Samuel was never a man of many words, but he had one striking characteristic. He loved to tell stories about the family's past. He spoke of ancestors who came from far away, about hard times, and about secrets that had been kept to protect future generations. The story that most impressed young Richard was about a family treasure hidden in a special place on the property. "Boy, when I leave this world, you will be the guardian of our history," old Samuel would say, rocking in the chair on the house's porch. "There's something very valuable kept in this land. It's not gold or silver, but it's worth more than any wealth in this world." Richard grew up hearing these stories but never paid them much mind. He thought they were just the fantasies of a lonely old man trying to make life more interesting. When he turned 18, he went to Nashville to study and work, returning only during vacations to visit his grandfather. It was there that he met Jennifer, a pretty girl who worked in a fabric store downtown. They dated for 3 years, got married, and had Emily. Life seemed perfect in the Tennessee capital. Richard worked as a mechanic in a large shop, and Jennifer took care of the house and their daughter. They had plans to buy their own home, give their girl a good education, and grow old together in peace. Everything changed the day they received the news that Samuel had passed away. Richard returned to St. Benedict of the South to take care of the funeral and the inheritance paperwork. That's when he found the letter. It was inside an old wooden box, along with some property documents and old family photographs. The shaky handwriting of his grandfather said, "My dear Richard, if you are reading this letter, it is because I have already departed to be with the Creator. I know you often thought the stories I told were the fantasies of an old man losing his mind, but I can assure you they were not. There is something very precious buried on this land, something our ancestors hid to keep the family protected during very difficult times. To find what is hidden, you need to start from the oldest oak tree on the property and walk 16 steps toward the rising sun. There you will find what our family has guarded for so long. Be patient, my son. Some things take time to be discovered, but are worth the wait. With all my love, your grandfather Samuel. Richard read the letter several times, feeling a strange shiver run through his body. He looked out the window of the old house and managed to identify 3 large oak trees on the property. The problem was figuring out which was the oldest and in which direction the exact rising sun was from there. Jennifer found the letter interesting, but didn't give it much importance. She suggested they sell the property and use the money for a down payment on a house in Nashville. Richard initially agreed, but he couldn't stop thinking about his grandfather's words. 2 weeks after the funeral, he returned alone to St. Benedict of the South with the excuse of better organizing the deceased's belongings. That's when he started digging for the first time. He chose the oak tree that seemed the oldest, measured 16 steps toward what he thought was the rising sun, and began to dig with an old shovel he found in the shed. He dug for 3 days straight, making a hole almost 2 meters deep, but found nothing but dirt, stones, and roots. He tried the other oak trees, varying the direction of the rising sun, but the results were the same. Frustrated, he returned to Nashville empty-handed and with blistered hands. In the following months, Richard couldn't concentrate at work. He constantly thought about his grandfather's letter and the possibility of something valuable buried on that property. Jennifer noticed the change in her husband's behavior and tried to talk to him several times, but Richard always evaded the subject. The marriage began to deteriorate when Richard started traveling to St. Benedict of the South every weekend, bringing tools and supplies. Jennifer thought he was just processing the grief of losing his grandfather, but the situation became complicated when he started spending money on more sophisticated excavation equipment. "Richard, you're spending our savings on these crazy tools," complained Jennifer one day, holding the receipts in her hand. "We need that money for our own home, for Emily's future." "I just need a little more time, Jen," Richard would reply, avoiding his wife's eyes. "My grandfather was not a liar. If he said there's something buried there, then there is." "But it's been over a year that you've been digging. How many holes have you made on that land, and you've found nothing but dirt?" Richard knew his wife was right, but something inside him wouldn't let him give up. It was as if an invisible force pushed him back to that property every weekend. He had developed an almost military routine. He would arrive on Friday night, dig all day Saturday and Sunday, and return home on Sunday night exhausted and dirty. The situation worsened when Richard quit the workshop to dedicate himself fully to the excavations. He used all the severance money to buy more equipment and moved permanently to his grandfather's house. Jennifer gave him an ultimatum. Either he came back home and forgot that obsession, or she would take Emily away. Richard chose to stay. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. In the first years alone in St. Benedict of the South, Richard maintained a rigid discipline. He woke up at 5 in the morning, had coffee with dry bread, and started digging at 6 on the dot. He stopped only for a quick lunch and continued until sunset. He had divided the property into imaginary quadrants and systematically excavated each area. At first, some neighbors approached offering help or at least company. Mr. George, who lived on the neighboring farm, would come by occasionally to talk and try to understand what Richard was looking for. Mrs. Margaret, who had a small roadside store, brought fresh water on the hottest days and tried to convince him to eat something more substantial. "Son, your grandfather was a good man, but you're killing yourself over some stories," Mrs. Margaret would say, shaking her head with pity. "This hot sun will be the end of you. Why don't you sell this land and go after your family?" Richard thanked her for her concern but didn't heed the advice. He was convinced that with each hole dug, he was closer to finding what his grandfather had left for him. He had already explored the areas near the 3 oak trees, but he began to consider that perhaps there were other landmarks he wasn't seeing. As the years passed, the neighbors' patience ran out. What began as genuine concern turned into irritation, and then into open mockery. Richard had turned parts of the land into a veritable crater field. From a distance, the property looked like it had been bombed. "Looks like a meteor passed through the crazy man's land," commented Mr. Joe from the workshop, making the other men laugh as they drank beer at the downtown bar. "He must have dug up the entire property twice by now." The jokes became more frequent and cruel. Some children began throwing stones in Richard's direction when he passed through town to buy supplies. The teenagers invented a game where they pretended to be digging and shouted, "I found the treasure," whenever they saw him. Richard developed an increasingly thick skin around his heart. He stopped greeting people on the streets and did his shopping in silence, always paying with exact change and leaving quickly. His appearance also changed drastically. His hair, which was once always neatly cut, was now long and unkempt. His beard grew unchecked, and his clothes were always dirty with soil. Jennifer tried to visit him twice in the early years, but the arguments were so intense that she gave up. Richard had lost a lot of weight and seemed like a different man from the one she had married. She cried when she saw the deplorable state of the house and property, but he flatly refused to return to Nashville. "You chose between me and these holes in the ground," Jennifer said on her last visit with tears in her eyes. "I hope you're happy with your choice." Emily grew up hating her father. Gradually, she stopped asking questions about him and began referring to her mother's new husband as Dad. In their rare phone conversations, she was monosyllabic and clearly embarrassed to have to maintain contact with a man the whole town considered unhinged. Richard's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. He had sold everything he could to fund the excavations, the car, the furniture from the house in Nashville, even his wedding ring. He survived by doing small mechanical jobs for the local farmers, but his reputation as a madman prevented him from getting more stable employment. His diet was reduced to the basics: rice, beans, flour, and occasionally a little meat when he could afford it. He had lost so much weight that his clothes hung loosely on his body, giving him an even more haggard appearance. The town's mayor, Charles Edward, had been Richard's schoolmate in their childhood. He tried several times to talk to his old friend to offer help. He even proposed a job at the town hall, but Richard categorically refused any assistance that would take him away from his quest. "Richard, for God's sake, you're destroying your life over a fantasy," pleaded Charles Edward during one intervention attempt. "Your grandfather was a good man. But these treasure stories are children's book stuff. No one buries treasure in the backwoods of Tennessee." "You didn't know my grandfather like I did," replied Richard, his eyes glazed over, staring toward the land. "He wasn't a liar. If he said he buried something there, it's because he did." Charles Edward tried to argue that even if something were buried, 16 years of digging would have revealed anything underground. But Richard remained unyielding, as if his very existence depended on that search. The situation became complicated when the neighborhood organized to pressure the town hall to take action. They claimed Richard was destroying the local landscape and that those huge holes posed a danger to children and animals. A petition with over 200 signatures was presented to Charles Edward, demanding that Richard be stopped from continuing to dig. The mayor found himself in a delicate situation. On one hand, he had the political pressure from the population. On the other, he knew Richard was the legitimate owner of the land and, technically, had the right to do whatever he wanted on his own property. He tried to negotiate a solution where Richard would limit the excavations to a smaller area, but the man refused to accept any restrictions. During these years of solitary excavation, Richard developed his own theories about where his grandfather's treasure could be. He studied the position of the sun at different times of the year, trying to better understand what toward the sunrise meant. He took measurements with ropes and stakes, creating a rudimentary map of the entire property. He also began paying attention to details he had previously ignored: rock formations, changes in soil color, areas where vegetation grew differently. Sometimes he would find shards of old pottery or pieces of rusty iron, which fueled his hope that he was on the right track. The obsession took over every aspect of his life. Richard dreamed of excavations, woke up in the middle of the night thinking of new places to dig, and reached the point of talking to himself while he worked. Neighbors who occasionally passed near the property heard him talking to the earth, as if it could reveal its secrets. "Where did you hide it, Grandpa Samuel?" Richard would murmur as he dug under the scorching sun. 16 paces from the oak tree toward the sunrise. I've tried every oak, every direction. Did I misunderstand? He had developed an almost religious ritual around the excavations. He always started in the morning with a prayer at his grandfather's unlikely grave, located in the town's small cemetery. He asked for guidance and strength to continue for one more day. Then he would head to the land and begin work, always using the same shovel that had belonged to Samuel himself. Richard also began documenting his excavations in a more organized manner. In an old notebook, he drew rudimentary maps of the property, marking where he had already dug and making notes about what he found in each hole. It was a way to maintain some sense of progress, even when the days seemed to repeat themselves without any result. The loneliness began to weigh on his shoulders like never before. Some nights, he would call Jennifer just to hear her voice on the answering machine, since she rarely answered his calls. Emily refused to speak with him entirely, and that hurt more than any mockery from the neighbors. On one of those nights of deep melancholy, Richard found an old letter from his grandfather that had gone unnoticed during his first reading of the documents. It was correspondence that Samuel had sent to a brother living in Charlotte, dated 40 years prior. In the letter, the grandfather mentioned the family secret and said he had made arrangements so that future generations could find what they needed when the right time came. This discovery rekindled Richard's hope. If his grandfather had mentioned the matter in correspondence with other family members, it meant it wasn't just his own fantasy. There was something real behind those stories. He then decided to expand his research beyond physical excavations. Richard began visiting courthouses and public archives, searching for old documents about the property and the family. He discovered that the land had been acquired by Samuel's great-grandfather in the late 19th century, under circumstances that seemed somewhat mysterious. The man had purchased a property much larger than his apparent financial condition would allow. This discovery led Richard to a new line of investigation. He began to question whether the treasure mentioned by his grandfather might be related to how the family had acquired that land. Perhaps there were important documents buried, or evidence of some profitable business that had been hidden. But even with these new theories, Richard maintained his daily excavation routine. After all, regardless of the nature of the treasure, his grandfather had left clear instructions about where to find it, 16 paces from the oak tree toward the sunrise. Years passed without any significant discovery. Richard had become a folk figure in the region. Children from neighboring towns came by school bus just to see the man who digs holes. Occasional tourists stopped to take pictures, as if he were a peculiar tourist attraction. Some journalists from the capital even wrote reports about the case, always with a tone of mockery and disbelief. Richard refused to give interviews, but that didn't stop them from speculating about his motivations and his mental state. One of these reports reached Jennifer, who was mortified to see her ex-husband portrayed as a bizarre curiosity. It was also through one of these reports that Emily, now 18, learned that her father was still digging after all those years. She had built such a strong emotional barrier that she wouldn't allow anyone to mention Richard in her presence. Discovering that he maintained the obsession after so long left her both furious and sadly surprised. Richard's situation became even more precarious when he contracted a severe respiratory infection due to constant exposure to sun and dust. He spent weeks coughing and with fever, but refused to see a doctor or accept help from any neighbor. Mrs. Margaret, who maintained a minimum of Christian compassion for the man, left medicine and food at his door, but Richard rarely accepted the charity. During his illness, he was forced to slow the pace of his excavations. This gave him time to reflect on his life and his choices. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to question whether he had completely lost his way. He looked around the deteriorating house, felt the aches in his prematurely aged body, and wondered if it was worth continuing. But whenever he came close to giving up, something pulled him back. It could be a fond memory of his grandfather, a dream where Samuel appeared to encourage him, or simply the stubbornness he had inherited from the family. Richard would get out of bed, grab his shovel, and return to the land like a soldier returning to the battlefield. It was during one of these reflections that he noticed something that had gone unnoticed all those years. In the original letter from his grandfather, Samuel had not written oak. He had written carveo with an old spelling. Richard had always assumed it was a spelling error, but he began to wonder if it could be something else. Researching in old books at the municipal library, he discovered that carvalho was an archaic spelling referring to a specific tree from the region that was not exactly an oak. It was a type of ironwood tree that grew very slowly and could live for centuries. There was only one tree of this type on the property, in an area Richard had explored superficially years ago. This discovery brought him renewed energy. For the first time in a long while, he felt he had a real clue to follow. The ironwood tree stood on a natural elevation of the land, near the remains of the old fence that marked the original property boundary. Richard had dug nearby, but never with the precision that the new interpretation of the letter demanded. He carefully measured 16 steps from the trunk of the ironwood tree toward the east. The indicated spot was in a natural depression in the ground, partially covered by low vegetation. It was an area that seemed different from the rest of the property, as if the earth there had been turned over long ago and had since settled back naturally. Richard dug at this new location with renewed dedication. He felt he was closer to the answer than he had ever been. Each strike of the shovel was made with genuine hope. Each handful of earth removed seemed like a step toward the discovery that would compensate him for all those years of sacrifice. But again, after weeks of intense digging, he found nothing but dirt, stones, and roots. The frustration was devastating. Richard sat on the edge of the new hole and cried for the first time in years. He cried for his lost youth, his destroyed family, his lost dignity, and all the opportunities he had wasted chasing a promise that perhaps could never be fulfilled. Dear listener, if you are enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we are just starting out. Now continuing. That night, Richard made a decision that seemed unthinkable months before. He visited his grandfather's grave and for the first time expressed his anger out loud. "Why did you do this to me, Grandpa Samuel?" he shouted at the simple concrete headstone. "Why did you leave me this cursed letter? I lost my family, my dignity, my entire life chasing your lie." He kicked the dirt of the grave and punched the headstone until his knuckles bled. All the frustration accumulated over 16 years exploded at that moment. Richard shouted until he was hoarse, cursed his grandfather with words he never imagined using, and then collapsed into convulsive sobs. It was in this moment of total despair that Richard noticed something strange. There was an inscription on the back of the headstone that he had never noticed before. It was numbers and letters engraved almost imperceptibly. 16P CSN 3M. He wiped the dirt away with his shirt sleeve and examined the inscription more closely. That seemed like a code. 16P could refer to the 16 steps mentioned in the letter. CSN could mean something related to direction, perhaps Carvalho Sul Nascente, South Carvalho East. And 3M could indicate a depth, 3 meters. Richard ran back to the house like a man possessed. He grabbed a flashlight and went to examine the area around the ironwood tree again. This time, he measured the steps from the south side of the tree toward the east. The indicated spot was slightly different from where he had dug before, about 2 meters to the side. Even in the darkness of night, Richard began digging immediately. He used the flashlight strapped to his forehead with a band and worked tirelessly until dawn. When the sun rose, he had already excavated almost 2 meters deep. The soil in that area seemed different. It was more compact in some layers, as if it had indeed been disturbed decades ago and then settled back. Richard found some fragments of ancient pottery and pieces of rotten wood that seemed to have been worked by human hands. He continued digging all day, stopping only to drink water and wipe the sweat from his face. When he reached close to the 3-meter depth indicated on the tombstone, his shovel hit something solid that produced a metallic sound. Richard felt his heart race in a way it hadn't for years. He carefully cleared the dirt around the object and discovered it was a fairly rusted metal box but still intact. It was approximately the size of a small suitcase and surprisingly heavy. With hands trembling from nervousness and anticipation, Richard removed the box from the hole and took it to the house's porch. He used a screwdriver to force the rusted lock, which opened with a dry noise. He lifted the lid slowly, almost afraid to discover what was inside. The box contained several things wrapped in oilcloth that had withstood time well. The first item Richard unwrapped was a bundle of old documents, yellowed with age but still legible. They were property deeds, old certificates, and contracts that seemed related to land purchases and sales. Examining the documents more carefully, Richard discovered that his great-grandfather had purchased not only the property where he lived, but several other lands in the region. They were titles to at least 200 hectares of land distributed in different points of the municipality, lands that would be worth a fortune today. But there were more things in the box. Richard found a handwritten diary by his grandfather Samuel himself, with page after page detailing the family history and the reasons why he had hidden those documents. There were also old photographs, women's jewelry that must have belonged to his great-grandmother, and even some gold coins from past eras. The diary revealed a story Richard had never imagined. Samuel had written in detail about how the great-grandfather had made a fortune buying land from indebted farmers during a prolonged drought in the early 20th century. He bought at very low prices and later resold when conditions improved, accumulating considerable wealth. But the man was extremely discreet about his prosperity. He lived simply and never flaunted wealth, afraid of attracting unwanted attention or being robbed. When he died prematurely, he left only a few clues about where he had hidden the documents that proved ownership of all those lands. Samuel had inherited this information from his own father, but also chose to keep it secret. He feared that if the truth about the extent of the family properties became known, Richard could become a target for people with ill intentions. That's why he decided to create a trail of clues that only his grandson could decipher, ensuring the treasure would reach the right hands when the appropriate time came. Richard spent the entire night reading the diary and examining the documents. There were hand-drawn maps showing the exact location of each property, detailed descriptions of landmarks and boundaries, and even estimates of each plot's value at the time they were acquired. One of the most striking revelations was discovering that the town had grown over several of these properties over the years. What was now the commercial center of St. Benedict of the South had originally been family land. The main square, where the town hall and the most important shops were located, was built on land that legally still belonged to Richard. Furthermore, two of the region's most prosperous farms were established on land that was also family-owned. The current occupants only had old lease agreements that had expired decades ago but were never renewed because no one knew who the true owners were. The diary also explained why Samuel had been so enigmatic about the treasure. He wrote, "My dear grandson Richard grew up in the big city and perhaps doesn't understand the value of simple things. If I told him our family owns enough land to make him a very prosperous man, he might become greedy or irresponsible. But if he is capable of pursuing a difficult quest for years, showing dedication and perseverance, then he will know how to give the proper value to what he will receive." Richard realized his grandfather had created a kind of test for him. The 16 years of digging had not been in vain. They were a test of character that Samuel had designed to ensure the heir would be worthy of the family legacy. But there were even more surprises in the box. Richard found letters his grandfather had written to him over the years, dated as if he knew exactly when the treasure would be discovered. One of the letters said, "Richard, if you are reading this, it means you have persevered for many years in search of the truth. I know you must have suffered greatly, perhaps even lost loved ones because of this quest. I want you to know I never doubted your ability, but I needed to be sure you had the inner strength necessary to responsibly manage what our family built over generations." Another letter contained specific advice on how to proceed with the discoveries. Don't reveal everything at once. Find a trustworthy lawyer to study all the documents before making any decisions. Some of the lands may be occupied by people of good faith who have built their lives there. Be fair to them. Use this wealth to rebuild your family and to help your community, not just to accumulate more possessions. Richard also found one last especially moving letter. "My dear grandson, I know your wife and your daughter probably drifted away from you because of this quest. Don't blame them. They couldn't understand something that even you didn't fully comprehend. Now that you've discovered the truth, use a portion of this wealth to win back their love. Show them all the suffering served a greater purpose. A united family is worth more than all the land in the world." Reading these words, Richard cried once more, but now they were tears of relief and gratitude. For the first time in 16 years, he felt truly close to his grandfather again. Samuel had planned everything down to the smallest detail, including the family redemption Richard so deeply desired. But Richard knew he couldn't simply appear before his family with the news of the treasure and expect everything to go back to normal. The damage caused by his obsession was deep, and it would take much time and effort to rebuild the lost trust. He decided to start slowly. First, he would seek a lawyer to validate all the documentation and understand exactly what his legal rights were. Then, he would develop a plan to use the wealth responsibly, following his grandfather's advice. Richard stored all the documents in a safe place and covered the hole where he had found the box again. He didn't want anyone to know about the discovery until he was sure how to proceed. After all, after so many years of being seen as crazy, great care would be needed to present the evidence convincingly. The next morning, Richard bathed, shaved for the first time in months, and put on the least worn-out clothes he owned. He walked into town and, ignoring the surprised looks from the residents, headed to the most respected law firm in the region. Dr. Anthony Harris was known as a serious and competent lawyer. He had inherited the practice from his father and served clients from several neighboring towns. When Richard entered his office carrying a bag of documents, the lawyer had to control his expression of surprise. "Good morning, Doctor," said Richard, with a humility learned over years of humiliation. "I know what my reputation is in this town, but I really need your professional help." Dr. Anthony received him courteously, though it was obvious he was curious about what this man, considered unstable, wanted in his office. "I found some old family documents," continued Richard, placing the bag on the table. "I would like you to examine them to see if they have any legal value." The lawyer began examining the papers with the natural skepticism of someone expecting to find unimportant documents. But his expression changed drastically when he realized they were authentic deeds, original certificates and contracts signed by notary offices that still operated in the region. "Mr. Richard," said Dr. Anthony, after an initial analysis, "these documents appear to be authentic and quite significant. Where exactly did you find them?" Richard told a summarized version of the story, avoiding mentioning the excavations and focusing only on the fact that they were his grandfather's belongings that had been stored very carefully. The lawyer listened with growing interest, especially when he realized the legal implications of the documents. "I will need a few days to conduct a thorough investigation," said Dr. Anthony, "but from the preliminary analysis I can say that these property titles, if validated, would represent a very substantial inheritance." Richard requested absolute discretion on the matter. He explained that he wanted to understand the situation completely before making any decisions about how to proceed. The lawyer agreed to maintain confidentiality, and they scheduled a new meeting for the following week. During the following days, Richard lived on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, he felt a euphoria he hadn't experienced in decades. He had finally found what he was looking for and discovered that his grandfather had not lied. On the other hand, he was anxious about the practical implications of the discovery and worried about how it would affect his relationship with his family and the community. He decided not to alter his daily routine to avoid raising suspicions. He continued doing his shopping in town, greeting people politely and maintaining the discreet behavior he had developed over the years. But internally, he was carefully planning the next steps. Richard also spent much time rereading his grandfather's diary, absorbing all the advice and reflections that Samuel had left for him. One particularly touching passage said, "A man's true wealth is not in what he possesses, but in what he does with what he possesses. I hope you use this inheritance to heal the wounds that the search may have caused and to build a better future for our family and our community." A week later, Richard returned to Dr. Anthony's office to hear the results of the legal investigation. The lawyer had done meticulous work, verifying the authenticity of all documents in notary offices, public archives, and registration institutes. "Mr. Richard," said Dr. Anthony in a solemn tone, "I can confirm that all these documents are authentic and legally valid. Your great-grandfather did indeed acquire a considerable extension of land in this region, and the property titles were never transferred to other people." The lawyer extended a folder with all the research results. According to his calculations, Richard was the legal owner of approximately 300 hectares, distributed in strategic points of the municipality. Some of these lands were occupied by buildings and commercial activities, which created complex legal situations, but not impossible to resolve. The estimated value of all these properties, considering the current real estate market prices in the region, is between $8 and $12 million, said Dr. Anthony, observing Richard's reaction carefully. Richard felt his legs weaken. In 16 years of digging, he had never imagined that his grandfather's treasure could be so substantial. It was an amount that would change not only his life, but the life of several generations of the family. "Doctor, I need your advice on how to proceed," said Richard, still processing the magnitude of the discovery. "I don't want to harm innocent people who may be living or working on these lands in good faith." Dr. Anthony explained that there were several legal options. In some cases, it would be possible to establish purchase and sale agreements with the current occupants, offering fair prices so they could acquire the properties where they had invested their lives. In other cases, especially unoccupied rural lands, Richard could simply reassume possession immediately. The lawyer also suggested that Richard consider creating a company or foundation to manage the properties in an organized way. This would allow generating constant income through rents and leases, maintaining long-term financial stability. Richard asked for a few more days to reflect on the options before making any definitive decision. He wanted to talk to people he trusted, and most importantly, find a way to share this discovery with Jennifer and Emily. That night, Richard called Jennifer for the first time in over 2 years. She answered the phone with surprise and a certain coldness, but agreed to listen to him. "Jen, I know you have no reason to believe me after everything that happened," said Richard, choosing his words carefully. "But I really need to talk to you and Emily. It's about something that could change our lives forever." Jennifer hesitated. In recent years, she had built a relatively stable life in Nashville. She worked as a seamstress and had started a discreet relationship with a widower who treated both her and Emily well. The idea of getting involved again with Richard and his obsessions was not attractive. "Richard, you hurt me a lot. I don't know if I'm ready to hear another one of your stories about buried treasure," she replied with a tired voice. "I know, Jen. I know I was a terrible husband and a terrible father, but this time it's different. I really found something that can give us a chance to start over the right way." Jennifer agreed to receive a visit from Richard, but made it clear it would only be for a conversation, and that there were no promises of reconciliation. She also said she would talk to Emily to see if their daughter would be willing to join the conversation. Richard spent the next few days carefully preparing how he would present the discovery to his family. He knew that after years of distrust, he would need to show concrete and convincing evidence. He asked Dr. Anthony to prepare a simplified report that anyone could understand, documenting the authenticity and value of the discovered properties. During the trip back to Nashville, Richard felt a mix of nervousness and hope he hadn't experienced in decades. It was his chance to prove that the sacrifices had been worth it, but he also knew that the success of the meeting would depend on how he presented the information. Jennifer greeted him at the door with a guarded expression. She had lost a little weight and had a few grey hairs, but she still maintained the beauty that had won Richard over decades ago. Emily was sitting in the living room, an 18-year-old young woman who had inherited her mother's expressive eyes and the strong bone structure of her father's family. "Hi, Dad," said Emily, without much enthusiasm, but without the open hostility of previous years. Richard was moved to see them together. He realized how much he had lost by being away from his family for so many years. Emily had transformed from a child into a grown woman, and he had completely missed that transition. "Thank you for having me," said Richard, trying to control his emotion. "I know I don't deserve your attention after everything I've done." Jennifer served coffee, and they sat in the small living room of the apartment. Richard noticed it was a simple but well-kept home, and felt a pang of guilt realizing his family had had to start life over from scratch because of his choices. "Richard, you said you had something important to tell us," said Jennifer, getting straight to the point. "Please be direct. We don't want to hear any more stories about treasures and excavations." Richard took a deep breath and took from his bag a folder with the documents organized by Dr. Anthony. "Jen, Emily, I know you think I've gone completely crazy these past few years, and maybe you were right, but I want you to know that I have finally found what I was looking for." He opened the folder and showed the authenticated copies of the property deeds, the lawyer's report, and some photographs of the original documents found in the buried box. These are the lands my great-grandfather bought over 100 years ago. Dr. Anthony, who is a respected lawyer there in St. Benedict of the South, confirmed they are legitimate documents. Our family owns hundreds of acres of land in the region. Jennifer took the documents skeptically, but her expression changed when she realized they were official papers with notary stamps and recognized signatures. Emily moved closer to examine the documents with her mother. According to Dr. Anthony's calculations, these properties are worth between $8 and $12 million, continued Richard, watching the reactions of the two women. The silence that followed was absolute. Jennifer and Emily looked at each other with an expression of disbelief mixed with caution. After so many years of hearing fanciful stories about treasures, it was hard to believe that this time it might be true. "Richard," said Jennifer slowly, "even if these documents are authentic, it doesn't change the fact that you destroyed our family by chasing this obsession." "I know, Jen. I know I hurt you deeply. I know I was selfish and irresponsible. But now I have the chance to make up for all the suffering I caused." Richard explained that he wanted to use part of the wealth to rebuild the family. He could buy a large house where everyone could live comfortably, pay for Emily's education at any university she chose, and ensure they would never face financial hardship again. "I also want to help the community of St. Benedict of the South," continued Richard. "My grandfather left instructions for me to use this inheritance responsibly, not just to accumulate wealth." Emily, who had remained silent throughout the explanation, finally spoke up. "Dad, how can we be sure this isn't just another fantasy? You spent 16 years digging holes in the middle of nowhere. How do we know these papers aren't forgeries or dreams of your imagination?" Richard understood his daughter's suspicion perfectly. He himself would have reacted the same way if he were in her place. "Emily, you have every right to doubt. That's why I brought Dr. Anthony Harris's card," said Richard, handing over the lawyer's business card. "Call him. Ask all the questions you want. He will confirm everything I've said." Jennifer took the card and said she would do some independent investigation before believing anything. Richard completely agreed with this precaution and said he would stay in a cheap hotel in town for the next few days, awaiting their decision. "I'm not asking you to forgive me immediately," said Richard before leaving. "I'm only asking for a chance to prove that this time it's different, that all the suffering we went through finally had some purpose." In the following days, Jennifer and Emily conducted a thorough investigation. They called Dr. Anthony Harris and spoke at length with him about the documents and Richard's discoveries. The lawyer confirmed every detail and even offered to send additional copies of the papers by email. They also contacted other lawyers in Nashville to get a second opinion on the legal validity of the documents. All confirmed that these were legitimate property deeds that would indeed grant Richard substantial rights to several lands in the region. During this investigation, Emily began to feel a shift in her feelings toward her father. For the first time, she could see that perhaps there was some logic behind the obsession that had destroyed her childhood. If her grandfather had truly left clues about a real inheritance, then Richard hadn't been completely crazy, just determined beyond any reasonable measure. Jennifer was also processing complex emotions. On one hand, she felt a bitter satisfaction in realizing that Richard had actually found something after so many years of sacrifice. On the other hand, she was furious for having lost the best years of her life because of a quest she never understood or supported. After a week of investigations, they scheduled a new meeting with Richard. This time, the atmosphere was less hostile, though there was still much caution in the air. "Richard," said Jennifer, "we've spoken with several lawyers, and it seems you really have found something valuable, but this doesn't erase the last 16 years of our life." "I understand perfectly, Jen. I'm not asking you to forget the past. I'm asking for a chance to build a better future for our family." Emily spoke up with a direct question. "Dad, if you use this money to try to buy us back, you'll only prove you still don't understand what you really lost. The problem was never the lack of money. It was the lack of attention, affection, presence." Richard was impressed by his daughter's maturity. In a few years, she had developed an emotional wisdom he himself was still learning to have. "You're right, Emily. Money can't buy back the lost time or fix the pain I caused, but it can give us the opportunity to spend more time together from now on. Without the financial pressures that have always troubled our family, they talked for hours about how it might be possible to rebuild the family relationship. Richard committed to undergoing therapy to deal with the traumas of recent years and to learn how to have healthy relationships again. He also agreed to involve Jennifer and Emily in all important decisions about how to use the discovered inheritance. Jennifer admitted she had made mistakes too. Perhaps she should have been more patient with Richard in the early years, trying to better understand his motivations. She had become bitter and resentful, which also contributed to the deterioration of the marriage. "Richard, I can't promise we'll be a family like before," said Jennifer, "but I can promise I'll try to give us a chance to build something new, as long as you commit to really changing." Emily said she was willing to get to know better the father she had lost during her teenage years. She wanted to hear more about her grandfather Samuel, understand the family history, and participate in decisions about how to use the inheritance responsibly. Richard was deeply moved by their reactions. It was more than he had hoped to achieve and less than he desired, but it represented a real opportunity for family reconstruction. In the following months, Richard worked together with Dr. Anthony to begin the legal process of reassuming the family properties. As he had predicted, some situations were complicated due to the occupation of the lands by third parties in good faith. The most complex case involved a family that had built a small cattle farm on one of the properties. They had invested their savings over 20 years to improve the land, honestly believing they were the legitimate owners. Richard decided to propose an agreement where they could buy the property for a symbolic amount, well below market price. Another delicate case was that of the town's central square, which had been built on family land. Richard chose to officially donate the land to the municipality, avoiding creating legal problems for the public administration. For the unoccupied rural properties, Richard developed lease plans that would benefit both him and the local farmers. Instead of simply charging high rents, he offered partnership contracts where profits were divided fairly. Gradually, the community's perception of Richard began to change. People who had mocked him for years now saw him with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. Some neighbors came to apologize for how they had treated him, acknowledging that perhaps he wasn't as crazy as he had seemed. Richard also began to invest in the community, following his grandfather Samuel's advice. He funded the renovation of the municipal school, contributed to the construction of a health clinic, and created a scholarship fund for underprivileged youth in the region. His relationship with Jennifer and Emily slowly improved. They met regularly, first in formal meetings to discuss legal matters, then in more relaxed family lunches. Richard was relearning how to be a father and an ex-husband, this time paying attention to the family's emotional needs beyond financial issues. Emily decided to postpone entering college for a year to spend more time learning the family history and helping with the management of the properties. She discovered she had a talent for negotiation and planning, becoming a valuable advisor to her father. Jennifer took longer to trust Richard again, but gradually began to notice genuine changes in his behavior. He was more attentive, more present in conversations, and more interested in understanding her feelings. The therapy Richard had started was also helping him process the traumas of the years of isolation. 1 year after the discovery of the treasure, Richard made an important symbolic decision. He permanently filled all the holes he had dug on the property over the years. With the help of Emily and even Jennifer, they filled the craters with good soil and planted trees in the areas that had been most damaged. "It's time to heal the land and move forward," said Richard, leaning on his shovel as he looked at the restored property. His grandfather Samuel's house was also completely renovated. Richard turned it into a small museum of local history, where families from the region could learn about the town's past and the importance of preserving family traditions. During the renovation, they found a few more surprises that his grandfather had left hidden. There were letters specifically addressed to Jennifer and Emily, even though Samuel had never met them personally. In these letters, he apologized in advance for the suffering his strategy might have caused and expressed hope that the family would reunite stronger after the ordeal. The letter to Jennifer said, "Dear daughter-in-law, I know you probably suffered greatly because of the search I imposed on my grandson. Forgive a foolish old man who thought only suffering could teach true perseverance. Richard is a good man, but he needed to learn to fight for something greater than himself. I hope you can see that all this time he was fighting for the family, even when he seemed to be running away from it. The letter to Emily was even more touching. My dear great-granddaughter, even without the chance to meet you, I know you will grow up to be a strong and wise woman. Forgive your father for the years he was not present. He was fulfilling a mission I gave him, preparing the future of our family. Now that this mission is complete, he can be the father you deserve to have. Reading these letters, both Jennifer and Emily began to better understand the emotional complexity of the situation they had lived through. Samuel had orchestrated everything with an almost frightening precision, anticipating even the emotional reactions of people he had never met. 2 years after the discovery, Richard and Jennifer decided to renew their wedding vows. It was not an easy or quick decision, but both felt they had matured enough to try to build a marriage on more solid foundations. The ceremony was held on the restored property, near the place where it had all begun. It was a simple but deeply meaningful celebration, attended by the entire community that had witnessed the family's extraordinary journey. Mayor Charles Edward, an old friend of Richard's, gave an emotional speech about perseverance and the importance of believing in one's own dreams, even when the whole world doubts. Mrs. Margaret, who had offered water and food during the difficult years, cried with joy upon seeing Richard finally rewarded for his dedication. Emily became a respected figure in managing the family properties, demonstrating a business acumen that impressed much more experienced investors. She chose to study agricultural management, combining academic theory with the practical experience she was gaining. Jennifer opened a sewing workshop in town, employing several women from the region and becoming a successful small business owner. She used part of the family wealth to invest in modern equipment and professional training, creating quality jobs for the community. Richard became an advocate for the preservation of local history and the importance of family traditions. He often received visits from people from other regions who came to learn his story and be inspired by his journey of perseverance. The story of the Mitchell family spread far beyond St. Benedict of the South. Journalists came to report on the man who dug for 16 years and actually found a treasure. But Richard always made a point of emphasizing that the true treasure wasn't the properties discovered, but the reunification of the family and the possibility of contributing to the community's development. In an interview for a national magazine, Richard said, "People often ask me if it was worth losing 16 years of my life digging in the middle of nowhere. I always answer that I didn't lose those years. I invested them. I invested in the trust I had in my grandfather's words, in the strength of my determination, and in the hope of a better future for my family. The money I found is important, but what really matters is having learned that some things in life are worth any sacrifice." The property where Richard dug for so many years became a modest but significant tourist destination. Visitors came to see the place where perseverance had triumphed over disbelief. Richard created a small educational trail where he told the family's story and taught about the importance of honoring ancestral traditions. The site where the buried box was discovered was marked with a simple plaque that read, "Here patience found its reward, 1889-2023. Richard made a point of explaining to visitors that the dates referred to the period between the mystery's creation by his great-grandfather and its final solution. Dr. Anthony became a close friend of the family and helped Richard create a foundation to manage the social projects funded by the discovered inheritance. The Samuel Mitchell Foundation funded scholarships, rural infrastructure projects, and historical preservation programs in several towns in the region. One of the foundation's most successful initiatives was a program that helped other families research and document their own histories. Richard had discovered that many people in the region had clues about inheritances or family secrets, but didn't know how to properly investigate them. "Every family has its own hidden treasures," Richard would tell program participants. "They may not be material riches, but there are always valuable stories waiting to be discovered." The program became so popular that Richard began receiving invitations to lecture in other cities about family genealogy and historical research. He never accepted payment for these lectures, preferring to donate his time as a way of giving back to the community that had supported him in the toughest times. Emily excelled as the foundation's manager, developing rigorous criteria for project selection and ensuring resources were used efficiently and transparently. She also began a serious relationship with a young lawyer from Nashville who supported her professional projects. Jennifer completely reconciled with Richard, but always kept a touch of humor about the difficult years they had gone through. Sometimes I joke that Richard had to dig in the earth for 16 years to learn how to dig deep into his own feelings, she would tell her friends, laughing at her own metaphor. The couple discovered their marriage was stronger the second time around because both had matured through suffering. Richard had learned to value people and relationships, while Jennifer had developed an emotional independence that made her a stronger partner. Richard kept the habit of visiting his grandfather Samuel's grave every week, no longer with anger or despair, but with deep gratitude. He would bring flowers and spend a few minutes talking softly about the week's events and plans for the future. "Thank you, Grandpa Samuel," he would always say before leaving. "Thank you for believing in me more than I believed in myself." The tombstone was renovated and now included an inscription that read, "Samuel Almeida, a wise man who taught that the best gifts come wrapped in challenges." 5 years after the discovery, Richard decided to write a book telling the whole story of the family and their extraordinary journey. The book became a regional and then a national success, inspiring many people to investigate their own family histories and pursue their goals with more determination. During a book signing in Nashville, an elderly lady approached Richard with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Richard," she said, "my husband also spent years looking for something his father had hidden before he died. Everyone said he was crazy, including me. After I read your book, I realized that maybe I should have supported him more in his search. Unfortunately, he passed away before finding what he was looking for." Richard hugged the lady and said, "You mustn't blame yourself. We all do the best we can with the information we have at the time. What's important is to learn from the past and honor the memory of those we love." Conversations like this became frequent in Richard's life. His story had touched something deep in people, reminding them of the importance of having faith in their own instincts and pursuing goals that seemed impossible. Emily got married 3 years after the treasure discovery in a ceremony that brought together hundreds of people at the family estate. Richard had the honor of walking his daughter down the aisle, a moment he had lost hope of ever experiencing during the years of estrangement. "Father," Emily said during her wedding speech, "you taught me that it's worth fighting for what we believe in, even when everyone says we're wrong. That is the most valuable legacy you could have left me." Richard cried openly during his daughter's speech. It was the first time she had called him father with genuine affection since childhood. Jennifer also gave an emotional speech at the wedding. "Richard, you taught me that true love sometimes needs to survive very strong storms. Our family is proof that it's possible to rebuild bridges that seemed completely destroyed." Richard's son-in-law became an active member in the management of the family properties, bringing modern legal knowledge to complement the practical experience the family had developed. He also became interested in the region's history and helped document other similar family stories. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out, now continuing. The Samuel Almeida Foundation grew to the point of operating in 3 states, always focusing on projects that combined economic development with cultural preservation. Richard was especially proud of a project that helped small farmers document and protect heirloom seeds that had been passed down through generations. During a visit to one of these projects in rural Virginia, Richard met a farmer who had kept seeds of a corn variety his grandfather had developed for 60 years. The man had never planted these seeds because he didn't know if they would still germinate. "Mr. Richard," said the farmer, "your story inspired me to try planting these old seeds. If they sprout, I will have recovered a part of my family's history that I thought was lost forever." The seeds germinated and produced an extraordinary harvest of corn with unique characteristics. The discovery attracted attention from sustainable agriculture researchers and led to the development of a larger program for preserving traditional seeds. Richard realized his story was having impacts far beyond what he had imagined. He had unwittingly become a symbol of the importance of preserving traditional knowledge and trusting in the wisdom of ancestors. During a conference on family farming in Washington, Richard was invited to speak about the relationship between tradition and innovation. In his speech, he said, "My grandfather planted a seed of hope in my life when I was a child. I spent 16 years watering that seed with my sweat and my tears. When it finally bloomed, I discovered it had produced fruits that would feed not only my family, but an entire community. Sometimes the most valuable treasures are those our ancestors planted for us to harvest at the right time." Richard's speech was recorded and went viral on the internet, being shared by millions of people across the United States. He received invitations to appear on television programs, but always kept the focus on the message about perseverance and family values. Richard used the national visibility to promote causes important to him. He created a national campaign called Stories That Don't Get Lost, that encouraged people to document the traditions and knowledge of their grandparents and great-grandparents before they were forgotten. The campaign was unexpectedly successful. Thousands of families across the country began recording interviews with elderly relatives, digitizing old photographs, and researching their genealogies. Richard received hundreds of letters from people who had discovered family treasures through the campaign, some material but most emotional and cultural. One letter that deeply moved him came from a woman in New York who had discovered that her grandmother had been a respected midwife in rural Georgia. The family had never valued these stories, but through research, they discovered the grandmother had developed traditional birthing techniques that were still used by rural communities. "Mr. Richard," the woman wrote, "thanks to your story, I discovered my grandmother was a local heroine who had helped bring hundreds of children into the world. Now I am documenting all her knowledge so it won't be lost. I found my own treasure buried in the family's memory." Richard kept all these letters in a special folder. They were proof that his journey had served something greater than just enriching his own family. Richard's book was translated into other languages and published in several North American countries. He received invitations to speak at universities on topics related to perseverance, genealogical research, and community development. During a visit to Canada, Richard met a man who had spent 20 years looking for a document that would prove his family were descendants of landowners whose property was confiscated during the Canadian Revolution. Inspired by Richard's story, the man had intensified his search and finally found the papers in a historical archive in Toronto. "Your story taught me that we shouldn't give up just because others think we're crazy," the Canadian man said during a meeting with Richard. "Sometimes the crazy ones are just people who see possibilities others cannot see." Richard returned from Canada even more convinced he had an important mission to fulfill. He decided to create an international institute dedicated to researching family stories and preserving cultural traditions. The Samuel Mitchell Institute was established in partnership with universities from several countries and with funding from international organizations interested in cultural preservation. Richard became the founding director, but made sure to involve qualified academic researchers in the Institute's technical management. Emily assumed the overall coordination of the Institute after completing a master's degree in cultural anthropology. She had discovered a passion for research that perfectly combined with her practical experience in managing the family heritage. During the first years of operation, the Institute helped more than 10,000 families in 12 countries investigate their histories and traditions. Some cases resulted in significant material discoveries, but most produced cultural and emotional riches of immeasurable value. One of the most striking cases involved a family of Japanese immigrants in the United States who had lost contact with their relatives in Japan during World War II. Through the methodology developed by the Institute, they managed to locate distant cousins in Tokyo and reconnect with their cultural roots after 70 years of separation. Richard personally accompanied the reunion of the Japanese-American family with their Asian relatives. Seeing the emotional meeting between people who shared physical traits and cultural traditions but did not speak the same language reminded him of his own reconnection with family roots. "Every family has its own hole to dig," reflected Richard in his personal diary that night. "Sometimes it's a physical hole, sometimes it's a hole in the heart, sometimes it's a hole in time. But it's always worth continuing to dig until we find what we're looking for. The Institute also developed innovative technologies to preserve oral histories and cultural traditions. They created applications that allowed people to record interviews with elderly relatives in an organized way, and then connect these stories with historical documents and genealogical records. Richard was especially proud when he learned that the Institute had helped an indigenous community in the Pacific Northwest document its traditional language, which was at risk of disappearing. The younger members of the tribe had lost interest in the ancestral language, but through the project they managed to rediscover the cultural richness of their traditions. "My grandfather taught me that some seeds take a long time to germinate," said Richard during the ceremony for presenting the results of the Pacific Northwest project. "But when they finally grow, they can feed entire communities for generations." Richard's story continued to evolve even after he had already found everything he was looking for. At 65, he became a grandfather when Emily had her first child, a girl who was named Samantha in honor of the family patriarch. Richard held his granddaughter in his lap and thought how wonderful it would be if Samuel could see that his strategy had worked perfectly. The family was united, prosperous, and contributing positively to society. Most importantly, future generations would grow up knowing and valuing their history. "Samantha," whispered Richard to the baby, "you were born into a family that learned that the most valuable treasures are those that require patience, perseverance, and faith. I hope you grow up understanding that it's worth fighting for what we believe in." Jennifer, now a radiant grandmother, watched her husband with their granddaughter and smiled, remembering how they had gotten there. The difficult years seemed like a distant nightmare compared to the happiness that now filled their lives. "Richard," she said one afternoon as they walked through the restored property, "sometimes I wonder if we shouldn't be thankful for the difficult years we went through. If everything had been easy, maybe we would never have learned to value what really matters." Richard agreed with his wife's wisdom. He had come to the conclusion that the true treasure left by his grandfather was not the land or the money. It was the lesson about perseverance and the opportunity to grow as a person through adversity. The Institute continued to grow, and Richard began planning his succession. He wanted to ensure the work would continue even after he was no longer active in leadership. Emily was being prepared to take over the general direction, while a new generation of researchers had been trained in the methods developed by the Institute. During an international conference on cultural preservation, Richard shared a reflection that became one of his most famous quotes. "I spent 16 years digging in the earth looking for buried treasures. When I finally found what I was looking for, I discovered that the act of digging had transformed me more than any treasure could. Sometimes what we find is important, but what we become during the search is always more important." This reflection inspired thousands of people around the world to pursue their own goals with greater determination. Richard received awards and recognition from various organizations, but he always said the greatest reward was seeing other families reconnecting with their histories. One of the most emotional moments of Richard's life happened when he received a visit from a man who had been one of the children who threw stones at him during the years of excavation. Now an adult, the man had become a teacher and came to apologize for the treatment he had given Richard. "Mr. Richard," said the young teacher, "I was one of those children who mocked you when you passed through town. Now I understand. I was witnessing a lesson in determination that I only comprehended years later. I use your story to teach my students about the importance of not giving up on their dreams." Richard embraced the young man and said he held no grudge. The stone-throwing and mockery had been part of his learning journey. Without them, perhaps he would never have developed the emotional resilience needed to persevere to the end. "Every stone you threw at me taught me to be stronger," said Richard with a genuine smile. "In a metaphorical sense, you helped me dig deeper." At 70 years old, Richard decided to write a second book, this time focusing on the lessons he had learned about family relationships and community development. The book included stories of all the families the Institute had helped and reflections on how cultural traditions can contribute to solving modern problems. The second book was even more successful than the first. Richard donated all royalties to the Institute, ensuring the organization would have sufficient resources to continue operating for many decades. During the presentation of the second book in New York, Richard was approached by a publisher who wanted to turn his story into a film. The offer was financially tempting, but Richard imposed strict conditions. The film had to be faithful to the real facts, it had to promote positive family values, and it had to allocate a portion of the profits to cultural preservation projects. The film production took 3 years and involved the active collaboration of Richard and his family. Emily worked as a consultant to ensure the story was told accurately, while Jennifer helped develop the dialogue so they would sound authentic. The film was released with great public and critical success. Richard attended the premiere at a movie theater in Nashville, accompanied by his entire family and many friends from St. Benedict of the South. Seeing his life portrayed on the big screen was a surreal and emotional experience. "I never imagined my stubbornness would become entertainment for millions of people," Richard joked during the premiere photo session. The film's success brought even more visibility to the Institute's work. Richard received invitations to participate in television programs in several countries, and his story was documented by journalists from international magazines. Despite all the fame, Richard maintained his simple habits. He continued living in the renovated house on the property, kept his routine of visiting his grandfather's grave, and dedicated most of his time to the Institute's work. Richard also developed a special project for orphan children, inspired by his own experience of being raised by his grandfather after losing his parents. The project taught children about the importance of knowing their origins and offered support so they could investigate their family histories when they became adults. "Every child has the right to know where they came from," Richard would say during visits to orphanages. "Even if they don't have close family, there are always stories and traditions that can connect them to their roots." The Orphan Project expanded to also work with adoptive families, offering resources so adoptive parents and children could better understand the family histories of both sides. Richard had discovered that many adoptive families benefited enormously when they managed to integrate the cultural traditions of both the biological and adoptive families. At 75 years old, Richard received one of the most significant honors of his life. He was decorated by the federal government as a meritorious citizen of American culture for his contribution to the preservation of national family traditions. The ceremony took place in Washington and was attended by authorities, intellectuals, and representatives from dozens of families who had been helped by the Institute. Richard gave an emotional speech where he thanked his grandfather Samuel for planting the seed of everything he had achieved. "I am here today not because of my own wisdom, but because I had the humility to listen to the wisdom of those who came before me," Richard said during the speech. "Every family has its own ancestral sages. The secret is to have the patience to discover what they are trying to teach us." After the ceremony in Washington, Richard returned to St. Benedict of the South and made a point of visiting all the important places on his journey. He stopped by the location where he had dug the first hole, visited his grandfather's grave, and walked through the renovated house where it all began. Richard also visited each of the families who had been affected by the discovery of their properties. Most had prospered through the fair agreements he had proposed, and several had become prosperous enough to help other families in the region. Mr. George, the neighbor who had offered water during the difficult years, was now 85 but still lucid enough to remember every detail of Richard's journey. "Young Richard," said Mr. George, using the same address from decades ago, "I knew you would make it. Maybe I didn't know exactly what you would find, but I knew a man with so much determination couldn't be completely wrong." Richard hugged the old neighbor and thanked him for all the kindness he had received during the most difficult moments. People like Mr. George and Mrs. Margaret had been angels in disguise who kept him alive when he was closest to giving up. During this nostalgic visit, Richard made an important decision. He wanted to spend his last active years personally documenting the stories of all the people who had been part of his journey. It would be his final project, a way to ensure the lessons learned would not be lost with time. Richard began conducting extensive interviews with all the long-time residents of St. Benedict of the South, recording not only their memories of the excavation years, but their own life stories and family traditions. The project became a rich collection of oral histories that documented a century of social change in the region. One of the most touching interviews was with Mrs. Dorothy from the grocery store, who had just turned 90. She told stories about how the town had changed over the decades and admitted that she had regretted mocking Richard for so many years. "Richard taught me that sometimes the people who seem the craziest are the ones with the sanest ideas," said Mrs. Dorothy during the recording. "If I were younger, I'd also be digging for the secrets my family might have hidden." Through these interviews, Richard discovered that several other families in the region had stories similar to his own. Grandparents who had mentioned secrets or treasures, old documents that were never properly investigated, traditions that had been lost over the generations. This inspired him to create one final project through the Institute, a national campaign called Every Family Has Its Story, that offered free resources to any family interested in investigating their own traditions and possible inheritances. The campaign saw massive participation. In just 2 years, more than 100,000 families from the United States signed up to receive guidance on how to research their genealogies, how to preserve old documents, and how to document oral histories before they were lost. Richard personally followed some of the most interesting cases. A family of fishermen in Georgia discovered that their ancestors had developed traditional navigation techniques that interested maritime history researchers. A family of artisans in Pennsylvania rediscovered century-old recipes for natural pigments that were being used to restore colonial works of art. But the case that moved Richard the most was that of a family in Texas who discovered a direct genealogical link to him. Through the research, they found they shared a common ancestor from the 18th century, and that their families had been separated by internal migrations over 200 years ago. "Richard," said the Texan patriarch during the family gathering, "it seems your grandfather didn't hide treasures just for you. Through your story, our family also rediscovered riches we had lost." Richard was deeply moved to discover he had distant relatives who shared physical characteristics and even similar mannerisms to his own. The family reunion became a 3-day celebration, with exchanges of stories, photographs, and culinary traditions. This discovery inspired Richard to create a national genealogical database that would allow families in the United States to find lost connections with each other. The project would be his final legacy for the country, a way to help millions of people rebuild their extended family networks. At 80 years old, Richard officially retired from active leadership of the Institute, passing all responsibilities to Emily, who had become an internationally recognized expert in family cultural preservation. The handover ceremony was held at the family property, on the exact spot where the box had been discovered decades earlier. "Emily," Richard said during the ceremony, "I am entrusting to you not just the leadership of this institute, but the responsibility to keep digging, no longer in the earth but in the stories, the traditions, the connections that bind human families." Emily accepted the responsibility with the maturity of someone who had grown up understanding the value of family roots. She already had ambitious plans to expand the Institute's work to other continents and to integrate modern technologies with traditional methods of cultural preservation. Richard spent his active final years traveling across the United States to personally meet some of the thousands of families who had been helped by the Institute. Each visit was a new lesson about the diversity and richness of American family traditions. On a ranch in the Everglades, he met a family that had preserved for 5 generations traditional cattle-raising techniques adapted to the region's unique characteristics. In the interior of Alaska, he visited descendants of rubber tappers who maintained ancestral knowledge about the forest that was helping modern researchers develop natural medicines. "Every family I meet teaches me that the United States is a country built on hidden treasures," Richard reflected in one of his last interviews. "Not treasures of gold or silver, but treasures of wisdom, tradition, and family love that pass from generation to generation." Richard also dedicated time to writing personal letters to each of his grandchildren, following the example set by his grandfather Samuel. In these letters, he shared the most important lessons he had learned and offered guidance so future generations could continue honoring and preserving the family history. For his granddaughter Samantha, who was now 15 and showed an interest in the field of history, Richard wrote, "My dear granddaughter, you were born into a family that learned that true treasures always require patience to be discovered. I hope you continue our tradition of valuing the past, but always in service of building a better future. Remember that each generation has the responsibility to add its own chapter to the family's story. Richard died peacefully at 85, surrounded by family in the same house where he was born and where his grandfather Samuel had told the first stories about the buried treasure. His last word was "found," spoken with a smile on his lips. Richard's funeral brought together thousands of people from across the United States and from several other countries. Representatives from hundreds of families who had been helped by the Institute came to pay their respects to the man who had dedicated his life to preserving family stories. The eulogy was delivered by Emily, who spoke about how her father had transformed a seemingly destructive obsession into a positive force that benefited millions of people. "My father taught the world that it's worth digging deep when we believe in something," Emily told the gathered crowd. "He dug in the earth for 16 years, but then dug even deeper into the family stories of thousands of people. His legacy is not buried. It is flourishing in every family that has rediscovered its roots through the work he started." Richard was buried beside the grave of his grandfather Samuel, in a ceremony that blended Christian traditions with family rituals he himself had created. Emily planted a native tree over the grave, symbolizing that the family roots would continue to grow and spread. Richard's headstone bore a simple but profound inscription: "Richard Mitchell, dug until he found that the true treasure was always the journey." After Richard's death, the Institute went through a period of reflection and reorganization. Emily led an international expansion process that brought the methods developed by her father to universities and cultural organizations in dozens of countries. The genealogical database Richard had dreamed of became a reality 3 years after his death, when a partnership between the Institute and the federal government created the largest archive of family stories in North America. Millions of people were able to access resources to research their genealogies and find lost relatives. The property where it all began was transformed into a family studies center that welcomes researchers from around the world. Grandfather Samuel's house became a museum that tells the complete history of the Mitchell family and serves as an inspiring example for other families. The exact spot where Richard found the buried box was marked with a simple but significant monument. The inscription reads, "Here perseverance found its reward. May it serve as an example for all future generations." Samantha, following in her grandfather's footsteps, graduated with a degree in history and took over the coordination of the family museum at 25. She developed educational programs that teach children and teenagers about the importance of knowing their origins and preserving their family traditions. During one of these educational programs, a child asked Samantha if she was also looking for some buried treasure. "Yes," Samantha replied with a smile, "but my treasure isn't buried in the ground. It's buried in the stories my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my mother told me. Every time I share these stories with you, I'm unearthing a new treasure." Samantha's response was filmed and went viral on social media, inspiring a new generation of young people to take an interest in the stories of their own families. 10 years after Richard's death, the Institute had helped more than 1 million families in 30 countries investigate their histories and preserve their traditions. The impact had become far greater than Richard had ever dreamed when he started digging that first hole. At an international conference on family cultural heritage, Emily gave a speech that perfectly summarized her father's legacy. Richard Mitchell started by digging a hole in the ground, but he ended up digging holes in ignorance, forgetfulness, and family disconnection. He taught us that when we dig deep enough into our own roots, we always find treasures that can benefit entire communities. The work he began will continue, because every family that rediscovers its history becomes responsible for preserving it for the next generations. Richard's story continues to inspire people around the world. His 16-year journey of digging in the earth became a powerful metaphor about perseverance, family faith, and the importance of honoring our ancestors. When people face difficult times or doubt whether it's worth continuing to pursue their goals, many remember the man who was called crazy but never gave up digging. His story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unlikely places, and that the journey to find them can be as valuable as the discovery itself. Richard Mitchell dug in the earth for 16 years, searching for a treasure his grandfather had hidden. When he finally found what he was looking for, He discovered that the true treasure wasn't in the buried box, but in the lessons he had learned, the family he had regained, and the lives he had touched along the way. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this moving story. Do you believe Richard made the right choice by persevering for so many years? Leave your honest opinion about this journey of perseverance and family love in the comments. If you have a special family story or know someone who never gave up on their dreams, share it with us. Thank you very much for joining us on this exciting journey. Don't forget to leave your like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other stories that touch the heart.